Throughout history, countless wars have been fought. Empires have risen, kings have taken their thrones, and eventually, every one of them has fallen. But around 3,200 years ago, something happened that was unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. This time, it wasn't just a single city or a single kingdom that disappeared. Almost the entire eastern Mediterranean world began to collapse at the same time. The Hittite Empire vanished from history. The great Mycenaean palaces burned one by one. Wealthy port cities fell silent. Trade routes that had connected the Mediterranean for centuries were cut off. Bronze workshops stopped producing weapons. Diplomacy came to an end. Famine, migration, and war spread across the region. Today, historians call this event the Bronze Age collapse. But what caused it? Was it drought, earthquakes, civil unrest? Or was it the mysterious invaders feared by the ancient world, the Sea Peoples? Egyptian pharaohs recorded them as people who came from the midst of the sea. We still don't know exactly who they were, or where they came from. Yet wherever they appeared, cities burned, kingdoms collapsed, and a 1,000-year-old world came to an end. More than 3,000 years have passed, yet this mystery remains unsolved. In this documentary, we will explore not only the Sea Peoples themselves, but also the world they entered, the destruction they left behind, the major theories surrounding them, and the latest archaeological discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of one of history's greatest mysteries. Because sometimes, history's biggest questions are answered only by a few surviving inscriptions and the ruins of burned cities. To understand this catastrophe, we must first understand the world that was lost. During the 13th century BC, the Mediterranean and the Near East were experiencing one of the most advanced periods humanity had ever seen. Although many people associate the rise of civilization with Rome, these lands were already home to powerful kingdoms nearly 1,000 years before Rome became an empire. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire stood as one of the superpowers of its age, known for its powerful armies and sophisticated legal system. To the south, Egypt flourished under its pharaohs, with magnificent temples rising along the Nile. To the west, the Mycenaean civilization dominated the Aegean with its fortified palaces and warrior aristocracy. In the east, Assyria and Babylon were growing stronger once again, while coastal cities such as Ugarit, Byblos, and Sidon became the beating heart of Mediterranean trade. These kingdoms were not constantly at war. On the contrary, they were connected through an advanced network of diplomacy. Kings exchanged letters, royal families strengthened alliances through marriage, merchants sailed safely across hundreds of kilometers, carrying goods between distant ports. Copper arrived from Cyprus, tin came from the east. Together, these two metals created bronze, the most valuable material of the age. Bronze was used to make swords, spears, axes, armor, and countless essential tools. Keeping trade routes open was not simply a matter of wealth. It was essential for the survival of entire kingdoms. The Mediterranean had become the ancient world's highway. Harbors were crowded with ships. Palaces overflowed with treasures from distant lands. People believed the future would be even brighter than the past. No one imagined that within just a few decades, this entire world would collapse. But on the horizon, a storm was gathering. No great civilization collapses overnight. First, small cracks begin to appear. Then those cracks grow wider, until one day, the entire system breaks apart. Toward the end of the 13th century BC, the Mediterranean world began to change. The trade routes that had operated safely for centuries started to fail. Copper and tin no longer arrived as reliably as before. Bronze production slowed, making weapons and agricultural tools increasingly difficult to produce. At the same time, the climate itself was changing. Studies of lake sediments, tree rings, and ancient pollen suggest that the eastern Mediterranean experienced prolonged periods of severe drought. The rains became less frequent. Harvests declined. Grain stores began to empty. Famine threatened not only farmers, but the great palace economies that sustained entire kingdoms. Bronze Age states were deeply interconnected. A crisis in one region could quickly spread hundreds of kilometers away. As trade weakened, armies grew smaller. Tax revenues declined. Internal unrest increased. Rebellions began to erupt in several cities. Around this same time, some of history's most desperate letters were being written. Kings were no longer sending gifts of gold or messages of friendship. They were pleading for help, because the coming disaster had become impossible to ignore, and very soon, dark sails would appear on the horizon. Sometimes, history tells us how wars ended, but only rarely does it allow us to hear the final cry of a civilization just before it disappears. That is exactly the story of Ugarit. Located on the coast of modern-day Syria, Ugarit was one of the wealthiest port cities of the Bronze Age. Ships from across the Mediterranean unloaded their cargo here, while merchants traded copper, tin, grain, timber, and precious goods with kingdoms hundreds of miles away. It was more than a trading hub. It was a center of diplomacy, culture, and international commerce. Then, at the beginning of the 12th century BC, everything changed. Clay tablets uncovered by archaeologists revealed the city's final days in extraordinary detail. These were no longer letters discussing trade agreements or royal gifts. They spoke of fear, of desperation, of cries for help. In one message, the king desperately appealed to his allies. Enemy ships had appeared off the coast. The cities were under attack. Most of his army was fighting elsewhere. He begged for reinforcements. Historians consider these among the most dramatic distress messages ever preserved from the ancient world. Because shortly after those words were written, Ugarit fell silent. Thick layers of ash, burned palaces, and collapsed buildings discovered by archaeologists confirmed that the city was destroyed by a devastating attack. One of the greatest trading centers of the ancient Mediterranean disappeared forever. And Ugarit was not alone. Around the same time, cities across the eastern Mediterranean faced the same fate. It was now clear, this was no ordinary war. An entire world was collapsing. And behind the destruction stood the mysterious people history remembers as the Sea Peoples. Ugarit had fallen, cities were burning, empires were beginning to collapse. But one question remained. Who were the Sea Peoples? Egyptian inscriptions mention them by this collective name. Yet today, most historians believe they were not a single nation. Instead, they may have been a coalition of different peoples brought together by migration, famine, and war. The walls of Medinet Habu, built by Pharaoh Ramesses III, contain the most famous images of these mysterious invaders. They carried long swords. They fought with round shields. Some wore horned helmets. Others wore feathered headdresses unlike anything seen in Egypt. One detail stands out above all. They did not travel with warriors alone. Women, children, ox carts, entire families moved together. This suggests they were not simply raiders. They may have been searching for a new homeland. Egyptian records mention several different groups: the Shurdan, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Jeker, the Weshesh. But who they really were remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Some scholars believe they came from the Aegean. Others point toward Western Anatolia. Some even suggest Sardinia, Sicily, Cyprus, or other Mediterranean islands. No single theory explains all the evidence. Perhaps the Sea Peoples were never one nation at all. Perhaps they were thousands of refugees and warriors from many different cultures, united only by survival. Whatever their origins, they would soon face one final obstacle: ancient Egypt. One after another, great kingdoms had fallen. The Hittite Empire was collapsing. Ugarit had vanished. The ports of the eastern Mediterranean were burning. Only one great power still stood in their path: Egypt, the richest kingdom of the ancient world, home of the pharaohs, a land defended by one of history's greatest armies. Yet Egypt was no longer at the height of its power. Years of drought, economic hardship, and border conflicts had weakened the kingdom. But its ruler had no intention of surrendering. Ramesses III. He understood the threat better than anyone. He knew the Sea Peoples had crushed every major kingdom that stood before them. If they reached the heart of Egypt, his kingdom could share the fate of the Hittites. So he prepared carefully. Egypt strengthened its coastal defenses. Archers were stationed along the Nile Delta. Warships blocked the river channels. The army waited. Then, the sails appeared on the horizon. Hundreds of them. Warriors, families, wagons, entire communities moving toward Egypt. As the invading fleet entered the Nile Delta, the battle began. Egyptian archers unleashed devastating volleys of arrows from the riverbanks. Trapped inside the narrow waterways, the invading ships struggled to maneuver. Egyptian warships struck. Those who reached the shore were met by heavily armed infantry waiting on land. The battle raged throughout the day. In the end, the Sea Peoples suffered a crushing defeat. The walls of Medinet Habu still depict the battle today. Sinking ships, captured warriors, endless volleys of arrows. Ramesses III celebrated the victory as one of Egypt's greatest triumphs. But historians continue to ask an important question. Was it truly a decisive victory? Or did Egypt simply delay the inevitable? Because although Ramesses won the battle, the Bronze Age world had already passed the point of no return. Egypt had survived. But the same could not be said for the greatest power of Anatolia. For centuries, the Hittite Empire had dominated the Near East. It had challenged Egypt at Kadesh. It had ruled vast territories stretching across Anatolia and northern Syria. Now, it was dying. Its magnificent capital, Hattusa, once protected by massive stone walls and monumental gates, would soon become a ghost city. How could one of the most powerful empires of the Bronze Age simply disappear? For many years, historians believed the answer was simple. The Sea Peoples destroyed it. Today, however, the evidence tells a far more complex story. Long before the final collapse, the Hittites were already struggling. Years of drought had damaged agriculture. Harvests failed. Royal archives reveal repeated requests for grain from neighboring kingdoms. Food shortages were becoming increasingly severe. At the same time, rebellions erupted along the empire's western frontier. In the east, Assyria was growing stronger with every passing year. As international trade collapsed, bronze became harder to obtain. Armies became more difficult to equip. The empire was being attacked from every direction. Then came the migrations. New waves of displaced peoples reached the Anatolian coast. Whether they were invaders, refugees, or both, they pushed an already fragile empire beyond its limits. Eventually, the system broke. Hattusa was abandoned. Archaeological evidence suggests much of the population left before the city was finally destroyed. They may have known disaster was coming. Soon afterward, fires consumed the palaces. Temples collapsed. Royal archives fell silent forever. The empire that had once stood among the greatest powers of the ancient world vanished from history. Yet the Hittite people did not disappear. In southern Anatolia and northern Syria, smaller kingdoms survived. Today we know them as the Neo-Hittite kingdoms. The empire was gone, but its people, its language, and parts of its culture lived on. Because sometimes, what dies is not a civilization, but the state that once united it. The Sea Peoples remain one of history's greatest mysteries. But were they truly responsible for destroying an entire civilization? Today, many historians believe the answer is no. They may have delivered the final blow, but the collapse had already begun long before they arrived. The Bronze Age world was an interconnected system. Copper came from Cyprus. Tin arrived from distant eastern lands. Grain moved across kingdoms. Merchants connected ports from Egypt to Greece. Every kingdom depended on the others. And when one part of that system failed, the consequences spread everywhere. Scientific studies of lake sediments, tree rings, and ancient pollen reveal that the eastern Mediterranean experienced prolonged drought during this period. Crops failed. Food became scarce. Entire populations were forced to migrate. At the same time, geological evidence points to a series of powerful earthquakes striking parts of the region. Ports were damaged. Cities collapsed. Trade routes became increasingly unreliable. Economic crisis followed. Governments collected fewer taxes. Armies became smaller. Internal rebellions spread. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries suddenly found themselves unable to defend their borders. Then, the Sea Peoples appeared. Perhaps they were not the cause of the disaster. Perhaps they were simply the final wave that crashed into a world already falling apart. Many modern historians describe this event not as the fall of a single empire, but as a system collapse, a chain reaction. One kingdom fell, then another, and another, like a line of dominoes collapsing one after another. The Bronze Age collapse may have been the first global crisis in human history. More than 3,000 years have passed. Cities disappeared beneath the earth. Great palaces became ruins. Kings were forgotten. But one mystery survived them all: Who were the Sea Peoples? Over the last century, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of artifacts from the final years of the Bronze Age. Burned palaces, broken weapons, sunken merchant ships, clay tablets, silent cities buried beneath layers of ash. Every discovery has added another piece to the puzzle. In recent decades, scientists have gained an even more powerful tool: ancient DNA analysis. Genetic studies suggest that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced major population movements during this period. Yet the evidence points to something unexpected. There is no sign of a single invading nation. Instead, researchers see people from many different regions mixing together. This supports one of the strongest modern theories. The Sea Peoples may never have been one civilization. They may have been many. Refugees fleeing famine, warriors searching for new lands, entire families escaping collapsing kingdoms. Some groups may have settled in the southern Levant, where archaeological evidence suggests connections with the people later known as the Philistines. Others vanished without leaving a clear trace. Were they from the Aegean, Western Anatolia, Cyprus, Sardinia, Sicily? The truth is, we still don't know. Every new excavation uncovers another clue. Every scientific breakthrough answers one question and raises another. More than 3 millennia later, the Sea Peoples remain one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. When the smoke finally cleared, the world had changed forever. The Hittite Empire was gone. The Mycenaean kingdoms had collapsed. Ugarit had disappeared. Egypt survived, but it would never regain the dominance it once held. The Bronze Age had come to an end. A new era had begun, the Iron Age. Bronze gradually gave way to iron. New kingdoms rose from the ruins of the Old World. The Phoenicians became the greatest sailors and traders of the Mediterranean. Centuries later, ancient Greece emerged once again. Then came the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, Rome. The foundations of the modern world were slowly laid upon the ashes of the Bronze Age. Perhaps none of this would have happened had that ancient world never collapsed. So, who were the Sea Peoples? We still cannot say with certainty. Perhaps they were conquerors, perhaps they were refugees, perhaps they were both. But one thing is beyond doubt. They arrived during one of history's greatest turning points. And whether they caused the collapse or merely accelerated it, their story became inseparable from the end of an age. They did not simply leave behind burned cities. They witnessed the fall of an entire civilization. And from those ashes, a new world was born. More than 3,000 years later, their true identity remains hidden beneath layers of earth, waiting for history to reveal its final answer.